The flame was a tiny, dancing demon in the deep Valorian night. Kale held it, a single candle, its light a lyre that showed only his outer stillness, not the tempest within. He stood over the hearth where the evening's fire had died to embers, their orange hearts still pulsing with a faint heat. His gaze was fixed on the shelf, on the single object that seemed to mock him more every day, a rolled parchment, tied with a simple blue ribbon. Serenia's teaching degree, the proof that she had climbed a mountain he could not even see the peak of. The villagers' voices echoed in his head, a relentless chorus. Serenia's wisdom, they said, the first scholar from our mud and toil. He remembered a time when he had swelled with pride her ambition. But that was before he felt the sting, the slow, cold drip of envy that had turned his pride to poison. He saw the way men looked at her now, not with pity for a peasant's wife, but with reverence. He was becoming a footnote in her story, the man who merely tended the soil she had risen above. A bitter, hot thought crystallized. Asterisk without this, she is just my wife. We are equals again. Asterisk his hand, trembling with a fury that shamed him, reached out and took the parchment. The ribbon fell to the floor, forgotten. He held it over the glowing embers. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, a curl of smoke, a sudden flare of hungry yellow fire. Now, he whispered into the consuming crackle, the words tasting like ash, now we are equals. He watched, mesmerized by the destruction, as the physical proof of her dream blackened and crumbled, vanishing before his eyes. Serenia awoke to a ghost. It was the smell that found her first, pulling her from a deep sleep. Not the warm, comforting scent of a cooking fire, but something thinner, sharper, a cold and final odor that spoke of endings. The hut was dark, but a gray pre-dawn light filtered through the window, illuminating the form of her husband, Kale, already dressed and standing by the cold hearth. His back was to her, his shoulders stiff. The wind was fierce last night, he said, his voice strangely thick. He did not turn to look at her. It must have blown a spark from the embers. A dangerous thing. Her eyes, still soft with sleep, traveled from his rigid back to the stone floor of the hearth. There, nestled against a half-burnt log, was a small, delicate pile of gray and black flakes. They shimmered, holding a faint memory of light. Her heart, with a sudden, sickening lurch, understood what her mind was struggling to grasp. Her gaze flew to the shelf. It was empty. The space where her future had rested was a void. The air left her lungs in a soft, pained sigh. The truth of it settled in the quiet room, heavy and suffocating as a burial shroud. A single, hot tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, but she made no sound to acknowledge it. She looked not at Kale, not at the man who had done this, but at the pathetic little pile of ashes. Her voice, when it came, was calm, a still, deep lake after a great stone has sunk into its depths. What envy burns, she said, the words clear and deliberate. The wind remembers. The world outside the hut was deceptively beautiful, bathed in the soft, golden light of a new morning. Serenia walked slowly to the edge of the whispering river loom, its waters chattering over smooth, ancient stones as if sharing the village's oldest secrets. The villagers were beginning to stir, emerging from their homes to draw water or tend to animals. They nodded to her with deep respect, their eyes soft with a sympathy they did not fully understand. They saw her quiet composure, the straightness of her back, and mistook it for an untouched, stoic peace. They could not see the hollow space the fire had carved inside her, the dream that had turned to smoke and vanished on the air. Kale, meanwhile, attacked his chores with a frantic, unnatural energy, his movements sharp and hurried. He avoided the villagers' questioning glances, his eyes darting away whenever someone met his gaze. To him, the gentle murmur of the river loom seemed to grow louder, more insistent, when he passed. It was no longer a comforting sound, but a relentless whisper, as if the water itself was carrying the story of his sin downstream, telling it to the stones and the reeds. Children playing on the muddy bank that day would later tell their parents that the river sounded different, that its song was a low, mournful melody, a tune of sadness and loss that hadn't been there the day before. That evening, the air in the village tavern was thick with smoke and loud talk. Cale sat in the center of it, a large clay mug of ale clutched tightly in his hand. He had been drinking deeply, seeking courage in the bitter brew, but it only fueled a desperate, false bravado. "A woman's place," he announced, his voice too loud, cutting through the chatter, "is with her hands in the soil or tending the hearth, not with her head stuck in dusty books." A few men glanced his way, their expressions unreadable. "I have my wife back," Cale continued, a strained smile on his face. "A simple life, a humble life. That is an honest life, don't you think?" His laughter rang out, harsh and brittle, a sound that tried to hide the cavern of shame opening inside him. His friends shifted uncomfortably on their stools. They remembered a different Cale, a man whose face would light up with genuine pride when he spoke of Serenia's studies, of the clever things she would say. That man was gone, replaced by this hollow, boasting shell. He tried to bury his guilt under the noise and the ale, but every time the tavern door creaked open, his body tensed, his heart lurching with the fear that Serenia would be standing there, her calm eyes seeing straight through his pathetic performance. The next day, as the sun climbed high, Serenia did not retreat into her hut to grieve. Instead, she walked to the village center, to the great, sprawling banyan tree, whose branches were like a sheltering roof. She quietly gathered the children of the village around her. They came, curious and bright-eyed. "Today," she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying a strength that belied the ache in her heart, "we will learn about the stars. Not just as pretty lights, but as the ancient guides that show sailors the way across the endless, dark sea." She had no parchment to unroll, no royal seal to prove her right to impart such knowledge. She had only the words in her mind and a well of kindness that seemed deeper than her loss. The children listened, captivated by her stories of constellations and heroes written in the night sky. News of the free lessons spread quickly. Soon, mothers and fathers, finished with their morning chores, lingered at the edge of the gathering, listening to the woman they had started to call the mistress of the wind. She taught not for coin, nor for the status the burned degree would have granted her. She taught because the fire that had consumed her parchment could not touch the light of knowledge that burned within her soul. A full cycle of the moon passed. The memory of the fire began to fade, covered by the dust of daily life, though the ashes in the hearth remained, untouched. Then a stranger came. He rode into Valoria on a horse so sleek and well-bred it made the village ponies look shaggy and small. The man's cloak was of fine, dark wool, and the scroll he carried in his hand was sealed with a lump of gleaming gold wax that caught the afternoon sun. A hush fell over the village, a stillness of awe and curiosity. The messenger dismounted gracefully, his boots barely making a sound on the packed earth. He walked directly to Serenia's small hut. Cale was returning from the fields, a hoe slung over his shoulder, his body aching with a fatigue that was more of the spirit than the muscle. He stopped dead in his tracks. "I seek Lady Serenia of Valoria," the messenger announced, his voice crisp and formal, carrying in the sudden quiet. Cale's blood seemed to turn to ice in his veins. Serenia stepped out of the hut, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her simple apron. The messenger, to everyone's astonishment, bowed low. "From the royal scriptorium," he said, presenting the letter with a flourish. Cale's world shrank, tunneled, until it contained nothing but that single, gilded scroll, a thing of beauty that felt more threatening than any weapon. The night felt heavy, pressing down on the hut. Serenia, exhausted from a day of teaching and baking, slept a deep, untroubled sleep. But Cale lay awake, his guilt a living, writhing creature in his gut. The sealed letter lay on the table like an accusation. Finally, driven by a panic he could no longer control, he crept from the bed. He took the letter and slipped outside into the cold moonlight. His hands shook as he broke the magnificent seal, the wax cracking with a sound like a tiny bone snapping. He unfolded the thick, expensive paper. The words written in an elegant, flowing script made his heart shrivel into a hard, cold pebble. The Queen's own scribes praised Serenia's submitted essay on the healing properties of local herbs as a work of profound genius and practical benefit. She was formally summoned to the capital to stand before the Queen and be honored in a grand ceremony. But then his eyes found the final sentence, and the world dropped out from under him. To claim this honor, and to receive the royal appointment that accompanies it, you must present your teaching degree for royal certification and sealing. The letter slipped from his numb fingers. He had destroyed it. He had burned the only key that could unlock this glorious, once-in-a-lifetime destiny. The invitation was not a gift. It was a cruel joke, a spotlight shining directly on his crime. A cold, sharp terror seized Cale, freezing the blood in his veins. He would not, let Serenia see this letter. It would be a confession, a direct admission of his terrible, jealous act. It would show her the magnificent future he had stolen from her, and it would shatter her completely. It would destroy any last shred of her feeling for him. His mind raced, frantic and wild. With trembling, clumsy hands, he snatched the letter from the ground. He looked around, his eyes wild in the moonlight, and they fell upon the old, gnarled fig tree at the far edge of their small garden. It was the very spot where, weeks before, he had guiltily scattered the ashes from the hearth. It seemed fitting a dark and secret grave. He dropped to his knees and dug a small, shallow hole with his bare hands, the cool soil packing under his fingernails. He shoved the beautiful, damning letter into the earth and covered it, pressing the soil down hard, as if he could bury his sin along with the paper. No one will ever know, he whispered to the darkness, a desperate mantra. It will be as if it never was. He returned to his bed, his soul feeling as stained and heavy as the dirt now caked on his hands, vowing to never, ever speak of the Queen's summons again. For 3 days, nothing happened. Cale moved through his life like a ghost, jumping at every sound, his eyes constantly drawn to the patch of disturbed earth under the fig tree. On the 4th morning, a child's cry of wonder drew the villagers' attention. There, from the exact spot where Cale had buried the letter, a cluster of strange shoots had pushed through the soil. They grew with an unnatural speed, unfurling into buds by midday. By dusk, the buds had opened into flowers the likes of which no one in Valoria had ever seen. Their petals were a pale, luminous white, glowing with a soft, moon-like radiance that pushed back the gathering darkness. They emitted a faint, sweet fragrance that seemed to carry on the breeze, a scent that made one think of old parchment and distant, whispered secrets. The villagers gathered in a hushed, wary circle, marveling at the impossible blossoms. They named them ash blossoms, for they grew from the earth that held the memory of the burned degree. The flowers seemed to pulse with a secret, silent life, a beautiful and eerie testament to a truth that refused to stay buried. The day the glowing lilies opened fully, their petals wide like pale, luminous hands reaching for the sky, a new presence arrived in Valoria. She was an old woman, her back slightly bent, wrapped in shawls of a silver-gray material that shimmered and shifted like woven rain or morning mist. Her name was Elandra, and she was known in the surrounding valleys as the Weaver of Winds. She walked with a quiet purpose, her steps making no sound on the path, and she did not pause to ask directions. She walked directly to Serenia's garden and stood before the cluster of glowing lilies, her ancient, wise face illuminated by their otherworldly light. She did not seem surprised or amazed. She simply nodded, as if greeting an old friend. "Where flowers grow from fire," she said, her voice a soft rustle, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Truth sleeps beneath lies." Then, slowly, she turned her head, her deep, knowing eyes finding Cale, who stood rigid and pale in the doorway of his hut. "The earth is speaking," she said, her gaze holding his. "Not everyone has the ears to hear it." Serenia, with her innate kindness, invited the strange woman in for tea. Elandra accepted gracefully, sitting calmly on a stool by the hearth, her shimmering shawls pooling around her. Cale hovered near the door, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The old mystic's eyes, the color of a winter sky, seemed to see straight through the walls he had built around his secret. "The wind tells many stories as it travels," Elandra said, sipping the herbal tea Serenia had offered. "It tells of a great fire that was not meant to warm a home or cook a meal. It tells of hands that are not clean, that carry the stain of smoke and regret." Kale's face lost all its color. He felt exposed, naked. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, his voice tight and thin. "The fire was an accident. A spark from the hearth, that's all. The wind blew it." Elandra placed her cup down slowly. She did not argue. She simply offered a small, sad smile that held more power than any accusation. "The wind does not lie, Kale," she said softly. "It only waits for the listening to begin." That night, sleep offered Kale no refuge. He was plunged into a terrible, vivid dream. He stood in a vast, endless field of black ash that swirled around his ankles like a dark, dry sea. A great wind picked up, pulling the ash into the air, where the specks began to coalesce, forming words that hung, shimmering and accusatory, in the void. Asterisk jealousy. Thief. Coward. Asterisk they whispered his name, 1,000 hissing voices speaking in unison, a sound that chilled him to the bone. He saw Serenia's face, not contorted in anger, but filled with a profound, heartbreaking sorrow that was worse than any rage. Then he saw the Queen's letter, its golden seal burning with the intensity of a miniature sun, its light scouring his soul. He woke with a ragged gasp, sitting bolt upright in bed, his body drenched in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The phantom smell of smoke and turned earth clung to him, and the silence of the night felt heavy, watchful, and deeply accusing. Serenia, too, found sleep elusive that night. The strange events, the glowing flowers, the arrival of the Weaver of Winds, swirled in her mind. Then, a soft sound pulled her from her thoughts. It was not the normal sighing of the wind around the eaves. This was different, a faint, melodic murmuring like voices heard from a great distance, the words just beyond understanding. She rose and went to the window. The sound seemed to be coming from the garden. Pulling a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped out into the cool, still air. The glowing lilies pulsed with their gentle, steady light, and as she drew nearer, the whispering grew slightly louder, more distinct. It was as if the flowers themselves were trying to form words, their petals vibrating with the effort, calling her name on the very edges of the breeze. A shiver passed through her, not one of fear, but of dawning revelation, a sense that something long hidden was beginning to rise to the surface. Drawn by an irresistible pull, Serenia knelt on the damp grass before the luminous flowers. The night air was still, yet the petals of the lilies seemed to tremble, as if touched by a breeze that she could not feel. As she watched, captivated, she saw it. Faint, shimmering lines of gold, like tiny, living veins of light, traced intricate patterns across the white petals. They were not random. They swirled and curved, forming distinct shapes. A fragment of a royal crest, the elegant curve of a letter Q, the sharp tip of a scribe's quill. The lilies were not just whispering. They were showing her. They were displaying pieces of the message they guarded, the golden ink of the royal seal somehow blooming within them. Serenia's breath caught in her throat. This was magic, deep and old and purposeful, and it was speaking a language meant only for her. The strain became too much for Kale to bear. The haunting dream, Elandra's knowing gaze, the whispering flowers, it all collapsed upon him. He took to his bed, claiming a sudden illness. He was feverish, his skin pale and clammy, and he tossed and turned in a fitful sleep. In his waking moments, he would mutter incoherently, fragments of his torment spilling out. The fire wasn't me, and the wind stopped the wind. The villagers who had quietly connected the Weaver's arrival, the magical flowers, and Kale's sudden collapse, began to talk in hushed, serious tones. They spoke of a curse, a sickness of the soul born from a great, unconfessed wrong. Their suspicious glances, once directed at the strange beauty of the lilies, now settled firmly on Kale's sickbed. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, the walls built from his own guilt and the growing, terrifying certainty that the mystical lilies would soon speak his sin aloud for all of Valoria to hear. Elandra found Kale sitting by the village well, his head buried in his hands, his body slumped in defeat. He looked like a man waiting for his own execution. She did not offer him a comforting word or a healing herb. Her approach was one of stark, unvarnished truth. "The wind has no master, Kale," she stated, her voice clear and firm, carrying no malice, only certainty. "It cannot be commanded or bribed to keep secrets. It carries what it will. What you burn will return. That is the law of things. But it will not return gently." She paused, letting her words sink into his despair. "It comes now on a soft breeze, in the gentle glow of a flower. If you wait, if you continue to hide, it will come on a storm that will tear the very roof from over your head." Her words were not a threat, but a simple, terrifying prophecy. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate, the last crumbling walls of his resistance finally giving way. He had no fight left. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in dramatic hues of fiery orange and deep purple, Kale forced himself to his feet. He walked slowly, like a man going to his own gallows, to the village square beneath the banyan tree. He asked the villagers, his voice a broken croak, to gather. A crowd assembled, their faces a mixture of curiosity and grim anticipation. Serenia stood near the trunk of the great tree, her face calm but watchful, her hands clasped gently before her. Kale stumbled forward and fell to his knees in the dust before them all, his body racked with great, heaving sobs that seemed to be torn from the depths of his soul. "I did it," he cried out, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. "I burned her degree. I was jealous and small, and I could not bear her light. And when the Queen's letter came, I buried it. I buried her future." The confession hung in the twilight air, stark, ugly, and utterly complete. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. All eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, turned from the broken man in the dirt to the woman he had wronged. A profound, heavy silence followed Kale's broken words, a silence that seemed to absorb even the evening sounds of crickets and birds. Serenia looked at the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, now crumpled and weeping in the dust, utterly destroyed by his own shame. She did not feel the hot, sharp rush of anger she might have expected. Instead, a deep, overwhelming sorrow filled her, a pity so vast it left no room for rage. She walked slowly toward him, the eyes of the entire village upon her. She did not speak until she stood directly before him. Then, she knelt, placing a gentle hand on his trembling shoulder. "You burned my parchment," she said, her voice soft, yet it carried to every ear in the absolute stillness. "But you could not burn my purpose. The knowledge is still here." She touched her temple. "You buried a letter," she continued, "but you cannot bury the truth. It always finds a way to bloom." Her forgiveness, offered so quietly and with such profound grace, was a power that disarmed the crowd's gathering judgment and shattered the last of Kale's pride, leaving only raw, penitent sorrow in its place. Elandra stepped forward from the crowd, her silver shawls shimmering in the twilight. "The wrong was done with fire and hidden with earth," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "It must be undone by air, the element of truth." She instructed Kale to go to the fig tree, to the spot where the glowing lilies bloomed, and with the utmost care, gather every speck of the soil that held the ashes of the degree and the buried letter. "You must be thorough," she said. "Every grain holds a memory." She then commanded that this soil be placed in a simple clay bowl. "At dawn," she announced, "you will stand on the hill and release it to the wind. Let the sky, which has witnessed all, now judge what man destroyed. Let the air decide what is to be restored." Kale nodded, a glimmer of desperate, helpless hope flickering in his red-rimmed eyes. This was his only path forward, his only chance to mend what he had broken. The entire village of Valoria gathered on the eastern hill as the first hint of gray light touched the horizon. A solemn, expectant air hung over them. Cale stood at the crest, a simple, unglazed clay bowl held in his hands. It was filled with the dark, rich soil from the garden, soil that held the physical remnants of his crime. His hands shook so violently a few specks of dirt spilled over the rim. He looked across the crowd, his eyes finding Serena. She stood with Alandra, her expression serene, and she gave him a slow, solemn nod. It was not a smile, but it was an acknowledgement, a permission to proceed. Taking a deep, ragged breath that burned his lungs, he raised the bowl high above his head, and then, with a cry that was part anguish, part plea, he turned it over, scattering the contents into the waiting air. For a moment, nothing. Then, a wind, which had been completely still, rose from nowhere, catching the particles of soil and ash. Instead of blowing away in a cloud, the mixture began to spiral, catching the first rays of the rising sun and shimmering like a swirling vortex of silver and gold dust. The shimmering cloud spun faster and faster, drawing gasps and cries of awe from the villagers. The specks of ash and dark earth began to dance, to knit together, as if guided by invisible, meticulous hands. The faint golden veins of light that had been seen in the lilies seemed to flow from the air itself into the heart of the whirlwind, coalescing, brightening, forming a solid, brilliant shape. The spinning slowed, the wind gentled to a breeze. There, hovering in the air for a breathtaking moment, was a pristine, unscathed parchment. It was Serena's teaching degree, perfectly restored, as if it had never been touched by flame. At its bottom, the Queen's golden seal gleamed more brilliantly than ever, a miniature sun against the white page. It fluttered down, as light as a feather, landing gently on the grass at Cale's feet. A collective, stunned cry of wonder and relief rose from the crowd. As Serena, her own hands trembling now, reached out and took the restored degree from the ground, holding it to her chest as if it were a lost child. A new sound echoed from the road below, the crisp, clear rhythm of hoofbeats. The same royal messenger, his face alight with urgency and wonder, rode into the village and straight up the hill. "A sign," he called out, reining his horse before the assembled people. A great whirlwind of light was seen in the sky over Valoria from the capital's highest towers. The Queen herself saw it, and sent me at once to ensure her summons was received and to escort Lady Serena personally. "She awaits you, my lady." The timing was too perfect, too wondrous to be mere coincidence. It was destiny, acknowledged by the crown itself, set back on its rightful course by a painful truth and a touch of ancient, forgiving magic. Serena held the parchment tightly, her heart so full it felt it might burst. The grand hall of the royal scriptorium was a world of marble and stained glass, of silent, towering bookshelves and the scent of old ink and beeswax. It was a universe away from the simple, dirt paths and rustic huts of Valoria. Serena, dressed in her one good dress of simple, clean linen, knelt on the cold, polished floor before the Queen. The Queen, a woman whose face held both kindness and immense authority, leaned forward as Serena presented her miraculously restored degree. A scribe took it, his eyes wide, and handed it to the Queen. She examined it, her fingers tracing the golden seal, feeling the perfect, unburned parchment. She looked from the degree to Serena's calm, intelligent face. "The wind and the fire have tested this document," the Queen declared, her voice echoing through the silent, vast hall. "And the wisdom that survives such a trial, that emerges not with bitterness but with grace, is the truest light we can possess in this kingdom." She then placed a heavy, beautifully crafted medal of honor around Serena's neck. It was not just for the cleverness of her essay, but for the unbreakable strength of her spirit. When Serena returned to Valoria, she was greeted with cheers and tears of joy. She was their hero, their local wisdom-made legend. But as the days turned into weeks, life slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. Cale, forever humbled and quieted by his ordeal, dedicated himself to a new, silent purpose. He became the tender of the garden of glowing lilies. He watered them, weeded around them, and protected them from pests with a gentle, reverent care. The flowers, symbols of his failure and his painful redemption, thrived under his hands, their gentle light a constant, beautiful reminder of the sin that had given them life and the forgiveness that allowed them to flourish. The villagers would often see him there in the evenings, a silent, thoughtful figure moving among the luminous blossoms, a man who had lost his pride but was slowly finding a different, quieter way to live. Years flowed by like the steady waters of the river loom. The children who had been Serena's first students under the banyan tree were now grown, and they brought their own small, curious children to learn at her feet. These new children loved to play near the beautiful, whispering lily garden, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the flowers' soft glow. One little girl, with wide, innocent eyes, pointed to the lilies. "Grandmother Serena," she asked, "why do these flowers glow when others sleep?" Serena looked from the child's face to the garden, where Kale, his hair now fully gray, was carefully tending to the blossoms. She smiled, a gentle, weathered smile that held the memory of fire and wind and a great, hard-won peace. She pulled the child close. "They remind us, little one, that the wind forgets nothing," she said softly. "It remembers every word, every promise, and every secret. But it forgives," she added, her eyes meeting Kale's across the garden for a brief, understanding moment. "It forgives those who are brave enough to face it." And in the soft, evening breeze, the lilies seemed to sigh in gentle agreement, their light a soft, eternal beacon in the gathering dusk.